But I wouldn't just start with the SEO budget. I would start with the marketing budget, right? I think that's the big shift. It's not just that the SEO channel has changed. The same thing is happening in paid. The same thing is happening in social. AI is everywhere. And if we just keep on thinking of AI as an SEO problem, we're looking at it the wrong way. AI is a marketing problem.
All right, we are live. Welcome to our, I think, 86th episode on ThriveCast. And today with me, I have Hank Azarian. Let's not get confused with Hank Azaria. He's made it very amply clear about the entity relationships on that particular front with me. Our today's topic is AI visibility, primarily targeted for CMOs. And the big question that we want to go get an answer on is, should CMOs cut their SEO budget to add AEO and GEO related services on top of it, or are they one and the same? Just to quickly introduce Hank, I first came across Hank on the Edward show, where he and Edward were geeking out on almost about an hour on various SEO lessons from Hank working with about 5,000 odd publishers, and how TMZ won the news box by updating breaking news. And lo and behold, he started talking a lot more about the various tactical aspects of does llms.txt actually make sense or not. He touched and defunked many myths on that particular call. So here we are trying to take a slightly different approach in this particular episode. We are not going to go deeper into the practitioner's view, but slightly one or two levels higher up on whether this even makes sense, whether AEO GEO even makes sense, and is that a new line item, or is that part of the same budget? So before we get started, Hank, I think I want to maybe set the stage a little bit. We have been working with many CMOs, and they have been getting offers from various SEO agencies, some of their own, and they're saying, "Hey, we'll do additional AEO work for you or GEO work for you." And they are actually very confused. Some of the CMOs told us that we used to rank number one on Google earlier, and now there is our board slides are not saying anything at all, right? So it's very, very confusing. Is AI visibility the first touch point, that we should throw away the SEO budget and work only on the AI visibility part of it? So with Hank, would love to go deeper into that part of it, but before we do that, maybe take a moment to introduce yourself for the audience who may not necessarily know you yet.
Of course. Thank you, GP. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the show and have this conversation. I'm Hank Azarian. I am a 20-year practitioner of growth strategies, predominantly around SEO. I've worked everywhere from startups as initial hire one, who took the company to a million run rate, all the way to, as GP said, managing SEO across the raft of properties of over 5,000 publishers. So I've gotten a really interesting first row seat into how SEO has evolved over the last 2 decades, and how I've had to pivot my kind of practice in order to keep up, and happy to share some of the ideas and some of the things that I've picked up along the way.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love, we briefly talked, last week, and I'm so excited to go through, the ringers on this one. So Hank, maybe let me start off with the first question. What changed? I think, that's a big question around as Google introduced AI mode, and more buyers are starting to search on or doing research on ChatGPT. What's moment that you could reckon where the first touch point has moved away from the 10 blue links, where all of the SEO was essentially focused on getting the brand on the first page ranked, positioned well, to now they're not even being visible? So in your mind, what is the change that the industry is right now going through, and why is there so much confusion about it?
I think that's a great question. And where I usually start looking at this is, we have this kind of optimal view of what the buyer journey should look like. And it should look like a consequential funnel, if you want to think about it that way. So a consequential funnel means that we start with discovery, then we go to evaluation, then we have some level of validation where we look at reviews and expert findings, all the way to when we finally make an action of making that purchase. And, at the end of that, we probably create some sort of return funnel to kind of increase relationships and loyalty and create repeat kind of partnerships. What's changed so much now is in the old model, we assumed that our website was the point of discovery. Everything would start with somebody coming to us first, and we would get the first chance to set the table. And what we're seeing in reality with users now is that they don't follow a funnel. They actually hop back and forth between discovery, evaluation, and validation. In fact, they might discover your brand in a validation phase of one of your competitors, and doing that, then hop back to you. So as kind of the both the structure and the walls between these funnel phases have dissolved, we are in a point where it starts not making as much sense to assume that the website and SEO by relation is the core way people are going to discover your service or product, right? So
Yeah, so I think maybe let me maybe we'll go a little deeper on that one. So Hank, are you essentially saying that the old funnel is dead, meaning the whole discovery, evaluation, look at the commercial, intent, the entire funnel now is out the door, and
yeah, I mean, good.
is that what you're saying?
Yeah, what Google calls the messy middle problem is what we're getting now. Essentially, we have a compression of the funnel into a system that still covers a lot of those functional goals, but doesn't do it in a very neat channel by channel system that we can follow. So for me, the question is not really, essentially become a question where I don't really think about allocating by channel. I think
Mm-hmm.
about allocating by how we influence a buyer's decision and choice. And that means that our marketing campaigns are not siloed by channel. Our marketing campaigns are connected by value and objectives.
Okay, apologies, audience. We had a small break, so we're going to restart a little bit. I'm going to start with the first question there, which is essentially what changed. And maybe Hank, you can push back on me. If how wrong am I on this one? Has the channel changed? Is AI search now the first touch for almost 60-70% of the buyers? Am I wrong in that? Could you maybe share out your thoughts on what has changed and how's the market responding to it?
I think, certainly directionally, AI is a far larger part of the discovery chain. I think when we look at some things like the Similarweb data that just recently came out, what I find more interesting is that there is cross-channel pollution between a lot of AI and SEO. What I mean by that is when these users were surveyed, 35 of the users that used both SEO and search as part of the discovery found that they preferred the AI over the SEO, while only 13 of the respondents said that they preferred search as their discovery mode. So what we're seeing is certainly a shift, almost a 2-to-1 preference there, a little over to a 2-to-1 preference there in how what preference looks like. And I think the other piece of it is the downstream handoff is a lot more blurred, meaning that a user can have that first impression on AI, but eventually click through on one of your social channels or on organic or through paid. And that relationship will be captured by
Mm-hmm.
that particular channel. But in reality, that relationship was influenced further upstream by AI. So I wouldn't I wouldn't necessarily say that I think that the adoption has turned so much. But as we were talking a little bit before, what's happening is the user is blurring these lines. And essentially, we're measuring in a way that is comfortable and how we used to think about everything, which is search is siloed separately from paid, and paid is siloed separately from social. And each one of these channels have very specific roles in the buyer journey. The buyer doesn't care. Buyer doesn't look at their behavior in this way whatsoever. So what we have now is essentially a directional split between how we're measuring and how the buyer is interacting with our product and services.
Yeah. So, Hank, let me unpack this a little bit. So, maybe I'm seeing there are four elements that you're mentioning as change. The first one is the behavior has changed. Buyers are now searching a lot more on AI. In your mind, it's about 2x directionally moving more and more towards AI. Other vendors, right? Other vendors like Profound and maybe even Chat GPT, they would rather lean more towards 60, 70, 80%, probably to their benefits. That's the first thing. The second thing is the whole landscape. There was so much of tooling that was built around channels, channel performance, ROI on those channels, including multi-touch attribution, the journey map. All of that now goes out the door. Is that right? It's now the entire messy middle. We are back again to the good old SEO days, where everything is now becoming a more of a maverick play. Is that such a dire strait yet, or something still works?
I think the way I want to view it a lot of times is what is the central role of our website? And before, the central role of our website would be essentially the kind of the brochure of our business. We would, that was the way the website was sold initially. Or, hey, this becomes kind of the billboard for your business. This is how people discover you and what you do. And I think that has now shifted to where your website is more so a source of canonical truth
Mm-hmm.
that all these other surfaces will use and surface that. And essentially discovery may happen off site, and the functional goal of your website is now to essentially validate every fact, validate, making sure that the information that is being distributed about you is truth and valid and backed up by proof points that you claim on your website. So I think that to me is the biggest functional shift. If you're no longer building a website as a brochure and you're building it as a source of truth, what does that mean for your business?
But doesn't that change a lot of things, right? For example, HubSpot, talked about how their website traffic actually went down, and their primary business was to actually bring in the users to the website, get them to discover what HubSpot could do, and that was a big channel for them. So website visitors, even though they might have called it as a vanity metric on the number of views, number of page views a month, but that was leading to a brand discovery a lot more closer to what they could control. But what you're saying, if that is what is happening, if people are not even visiting the brand's website, and the brand's website is mostly for maybe a baseline source of truth as an entity, but all that research is done by the bots now, right? Wherein the Chat GPT bots and all of that, they are essentially calling your website based on what the buyer is now asking. So doesn't that now change? Your traffic to your website has now become a moot point. It's an unnecessary vanity metric now. Your
Especially
attribution
if
models are all gone the door, right? And your lead pipeline that used to come really from these channels, from these attributions, even that has, broken rank. Sorry, go ahead.
especially
Hank,
at
you can.
I'm sorry about that. I meant especially at the discovery layer, right? So what's happening now is the the fight has moved deeper and deeper down the stream. And now we are at kind of evaluation phase where you have to step in. We are at the point where you have to start creating a lot more comparative content about why you
Mhm.
stand out. And the way I like to think about it, and especially when it comes to SEO, before SEO used to be the guy that stands in front of your business with a big sign and it's spinning it around and it's telling everybody, hey, I'm selling this one broad category. It's a
Mhm.
2 or 3 word category. Maybe I'll add a best in front of it or tell you one feature of why, but that's fundamentally what I'm telling you to sell. And I don't care if 96, 97, 98% of you walk in the door and walk out and say, this is not me. In fact, my entire business is built on converting 2 to 3% of those people that walk in through the door. And as long as I can get a wide enough number of people to walk in through the door, I can convert them and I can create a really meaningful business from that. I would say that now you're not quite doing that anymore. You're actually building this really niche Brooklyn shop that sells one thing, but sells that one thing at such a level of expertise and care and understanding, and let's call it subject matter expertise, that when you actually walk through that door, you feel like this place was just made for me. And that's the experience that your website needs to create now. Not, oh, I'm coming in here because I may be interested in your product. Because by the moment I'm coming to you now, if you think about what we just laid out, a lot of discovery has already been done. They may already have an impression of you based on what your competitors have said in their comparative, model. And what you have to do is make them feel like, this is my pain point. This is why I came to you. And this is how your product and service is immediately solving it for me. And that is the fundamental goal of what your website and your business kind of marketing should be doing. And if we kind of think about that at a larger level, that conversion of that user is not being handled by one channel alone. That conversion is being handled by 4 to 5 channels working together across a very specific business objective. And that's the way I've changed the way I approach SEO. I really don't care as much about visits. And let's give it at the most simplest level. I work with a lot of publishers that work on impressions as their primary metric. And SEO used to be the biggest driver for those impressions. So it becomes, in their mind, the value of SEO is going up the chain to bigger keywords that have a higher potential for return, right? But when we started really looking at this in what I call key person SEO, not keyword SEO, what we found is some subset of those users actually came back to the site 4 times more. That this subset of users, every time they came to the site, actually consumed 5, 6 pages instead of 1 to 2. So they had a 3x value increase on that. And then when we looked at lifetime value from email, we found out that we can even, I think it was a 17x increase on lifetime value the moment that they signed up for that email, even from the returning user group. So there's still value in converting the returning user to email. Now, when you start putting all of that together, you realize that this one user is actually worth 8 of the other users from a revenue perspective for me. And that's the conversation I'm more interested in having with publishers now.
Yeah. So
how do I pick the users that's more valuable?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is the buyers are now coming to your website with pre-perception of what the product does, and they're coming in essentially to not do the discovery of your product because they have already done that with ChatGPT and all of that. They're coming here more to go ahead and actually evaluate your product for their use case. So it's very, very closer to the commercial needs, and the more of the bottom of the funnel kind of an experiences that needs to drive in. So with those changes that are coming in now, Hank, I know you talk to a lot of CMOs, you talk to various leaders across the board. How are the CMOs perceiving this? It's a massive change. They would have an SEO agency coming and pitching them about, or have been working with them, saying, "Hey, I'm going to give you a rank and position on this thing, and here's my fees. Here's how much of content I will build. I'll probably go and do some Reddit things for you, social media for you, and all of that." Now, that changes quite a bit. So what do you hear from the CMOs, and what's going on in their own heads about this whole confusion of AI search now becoming more and more of a first touch, and the discovery is now moving upstream, as you rightly mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm finding is a lot of frustration because the numbers that are being reported are moving further and further away from the business objectives, right? You can have a universe where your keyword rankings are still really high. Hey, we're still in a top 3 site on this primary keyword. When we look at impressions, the impressions are still really high, But now this is a keyword where a top three ranking used to bring us, let's say, 10, 12% click through rate, is now bringing us 1% click
Yeah.
through rate. And in those scenarios, we have to change the scoreboard completely, right? That's like number one. We have to build new scoreboards. And where I usually start with with CMOs is, let's try to kind of narrow the focus down, is like, what is the one specific job that we are trying to accomplish for this one specific user? So who, if I look at my business and practice, who is the person that we can help the most? Let's start there. This is the person. We can define them. We have data about them. We have, ideally some sort of either user model that we've built on that. And once we
The
understand that,
JTVDs. Yeah.
and once we understand this ICP, now we can build towards this ideal customer profile and layer objectives that are revenue driven, that are business objectives, and now build our marketing campaign around a very specific thing. Hey, our objective is to take our users who are very informed and have a specific opinion about our product or service before they came to us, and make them believe that our product and service is the exact need they have to solve the problem. So we are much more persuasive. We are much more specific about what we do and what we don't do. And we stay in our lanes. So I think that those are the three things that I find are the biggest lessons that I'm giving when I'm having conversations with CMOs. Because once we start seeing that, then the question doesn't become, is AEO a part of my SEO budget, or should I cut one versus the other? The question becomes, which one of these channels are actually meaningful to the user problems that my business is trying to solve? And sometimes that isn't SEO. Like many times I have been in situations now where I'm like, you know what? You're just launching this product. You don't need SEO. You need to understand who your real buyer is. And in reality, your SEO, like what people are telling you you should do initially, is more likely to be done something that you should do, you know,
Much later.
spending $250 on PickFu and running five campaigns, five 50-person campaigns, and then learning, okay, these are the things that are really resonating with my core audience. Let me now run, a $2,000-$3,000 meta campaign and validate those assumptions. Okay, now I have a real clear understanding of who my core audience is, what they like, what they don't like, and I can now have a more meaningful conversation around where SEO fits in, how SEO can be used in order to make proof points. And then on the other end of it, when I'm looking at AI visibility, what elements of AI visibility are meaningful and actually help?
Yeah, I guess that brings the point that, if that confusion exists in the CMO's mind, and when we are seeing that, hey, you might have to change quite a bit of things, that really causes them a concern. And, I'll give maybe two, three scenarios and we can go unpack this a little more. Some of the, founders and founder network friends that I have, and we talk about various things, they would have spent millions of dollars in the last 3-4 years on getting their pages ranked. They have an SEO agency who's been working with them, and now suddenly their traffic has dipped. Right? There's 3 or 4 companies that come to my mind, but I can't share their names. Their traffic has dipped by 87%.
Mm-hmm.
Have no idea where the buyers are coming from, which is where I think, all this whole prompt business, comes in, right? Here you run a prompt and you go find out, this is where your competitions are, this is the channels that your competitions are using, and they are getting cited here and you're not getting cited. I think that's the origin of that particular business. But I think,
Mm-hmm.
I think, which means that the running the prompts or some kind of an agent to find out what's your visibility in general versus your brand's visibility, that remains to be now a focal point. Now, would you agree on that? And is that the change that is now slowly coming to the fore, that it's not just the pure SEO play, getting out of the 10 blue links, but it's also your visibility outside of your domain to the places where your ICP hangs out with. Could it be Reddit? Could it be YouTube? Could it be wherever it is? And if you're not there, you're practically dead.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of kind of crystallizing what's occurring because we have what we have distribution that is just kind of exploding everywhere, right? It isn't that the distribution has gone away; it's that it's become fragmented across different spaces. Many of them that you mentioned right there, and in reality, every business doesn't have the same kind of distribution signals, right? And some businesses, Reddit plays a much more significant part than in other businesses. So that evolution paradigm is one of the first things you want to kind of look at it. Okay, where is discovery coming for us? And I think I usually like to kind of also think about what condition is my business in. Is like, are we searching for fit? Are we trying to prove repeatability? Are we trying to enter a new category? Each one of these distinctions will allow me to better understand where the right specific channel fit is. I don't really, for me, it isn't a question a lot of times of, okay, we need to reduce SEO spending by 30% or 40% or whatever. A
Hmm.
lot of times you may come back and go, we actually need to increase SEO spend because that's the channel that's closest to revenue right now for us. And it is moving the channel meaningfully. So I think the conversation initially is, hey, you have to come to terms that the traffic number that was the way you always thought about this channel as being successful needs to be thought of as a different metric. And that different metric has to be as close to revenue as possible, in my mind. The further away you are from revenue, the more, you know, ethereal almost the metric is to me. And I, I, I think that some discovery is great. I think that, ultimately where some AI visibility is great. I think it really moves. Where I start having problems with it as a driving metric is that inherently it weakens SEO.
Hmm.
If you take SEO and you say that SEO is a visibility channel now, then you're ultimately just a banner link, but text. And
Yeah.
you have to really think about whether you want to continue a business that is just a text-based banner link business. Whereas if you have this conversation and we're now talking about, hey, sure, and a lot of I do see the same thing, 40% year over year, sometimes quarter over quarter numbers that are down in traffic. And then we kind of break it down and go, reality was 60% of that loss were people that just came and left. If we run an impression based business, great. But a lot of the business I work with aren't really running a pure impression based business now.
Hmm.
And for those businesses, traffic loss, while, I think is illuminary in understanding where the movement is, can be crawled back by as little as crapping 20% of that traffic back. 20% of that traffic usually ends up, the old 80-20 rule ends up being 80% of the revenue that
Hmm.
group was generating. And sometimes actually in reality more. It ends up being 20, 90, 95 for a lot of businesses. So that becomes paramount. How do we capture that 20% back? And maybe that 20% doesn't come back in search alone. It comes back across 3 or 4 surfaces.
Right.
So now we can have the budget discussion. The budget discussion is we've been spending all this money on SEO visibility and SEO clicks and SEO rankings and SEO impressions. And today, all 4 of those things have much less, I don't want to say real value, but much less determinative value. I think determinative value is a better framing of that. And if they have much less determinative value, what has more value? For me, that's direct revenue. For me, that's conversion metrics that lead to that. And
Yeah.
as close as we can get to those decision cycles, the better. And if you're evaluating those channels through that, then you're now making the better business decisions of
Yeah. I mean,
distributing
this is
the
interesting, Hank.
the
As
the
you're
budget.
speaking, yeah, as you're speaking, a couple of things comes to my mind, right? So maybe we'll jump to that a little bit. But I think what you're saying is, traffic becomes more valuable. If that becomes valuable, this is not just a tactical conversation, that most of the SEO agencies used to sell. They would sell tactics, right? I'm going to go employ these 10 black hat tactics and make you rank on the first page or whatever it is. Now that kind of, maybe it still exists, but that's really in the back of the mind. It's you, what you're suggesting now is not necessarily the tactical conversation and the spend around that, but more around the strategic conversations on who is your buyer, where do they hang out, why do they come to you, and what should they get. So that changes the entire equation for them. So let me let me ask this question. If you have a CMO who has maybe a 100K budget, and let's say they're in early stage or mid stage, a category, their revenues are either flat or, have started dipping because the traffic has gone down. What would you recommend them? Where should they spend this 100K on what they used to spend on SEO? Where should they spend it now?
I think that what we start looking at is where is the decision happening? So that decision probably is happening across AI answers, search results, your social feed, community-based sites, third-party review sites. So once we understand that piece, I would take the money and distribute it across the channels that make the most sense. But I wouldn't just start with the SEO budget. I would start with the marketing budget, right? I think that's the big shift. It's not just that the SEO channel has changed. The same thinking is happening in paid. The same thing is happening in social. AI is everywhere. And if we just keep on thinking of AI as an SEO problem, we're looking at it the wrong way. AI is a marketing problem. And that means you have a holistic view of your budget and you have a real honest conversation across channels about where that budget goes. So if you have that 100,000 in SEO, I think in some ways a lot of that still remains on search-based surfaces, but they're focused on converting deeper down the funnel. They're focused on creating really differential content. They're focused on essentially taking the data and the knowledge that you have right now and creating experiences that AI can't easily replicate. I think that's the fundamental thing for me is how much of what you're doing can AI replicate with a prompt? And if it can replicate a lot of what you're doing with a prompt, then you need to really think about the kind of content that you're putting out there.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. On the flip side, I think what you're saying is the agencies. If you're listening to this particular podcast, you should maybe rethink about the services that you offer. I think what Hank is offering is probably very sane. Instead of you thinking about offering just an SEO service, you should probably be selling distribution, as a service, not necessarily only the SEO portions of it. And I think Hank, humor me on this one. So I am actually seeing so many of them reaching out, even to us. We are still an early stage startup. They even reach out to us saying that, hey, I will get you visible on AI, right? But on Reddit as a channel, and pay me $1,500 to $5,000 a month, and I will make sure that your brand is getting cited or being mentioned, always on a fresh, comments or posts every month, and I'll do 100 posts or 200 posts a month or something like that. So now there are these services that are slowly starting to come up where they're attacking a particular channel and saying, hey, if Reddit is a particular channel, pay me 2K to 5K a month and I will make you visible there. If YouTube is a channel for you, I will build videos for you. If something else. So now these are individual channels. Now they're slowly starting to come up. And I kid you not, I had not seen any of this even a few years back. Few years back, it was just pure SEO, and now all of these are individual channels. There is now another company which is doing. I will get you G2 reviews. Give me a list of customers, or I'll actually go find and scrape what others are talking about in your competitor space, and I'll feed them. I'll essentially build and package it for you, so that, and I'll run the campaigns with your customers, with your prospects, to come and do a G2 reviews. I mean, bang, this is very, very different than what it used to be.
Yeah,
So, what's your thoughts on SEO just as a line item versus distribution now becoming a larger line item?
right. And I think when code and content are cheap, what you end up with is like discretion and taste are probably the key moats, right? So yes, everyone can do everything, But fundamentally, the more important part becomes now is how are they telling a holistic story of your brand? Because yes, you can have somebody run the Reddit campaign and try to do this to their objective. But if the same user goes from your Reddit campaign to a social campaign that you're running on Meta that has nothing to do and is completely disjointed from that campaign, neither of them are effective anymore because the user is looking at the narrative holistically and not through one individual lens. So that's usually my only caution when people see kind of the guru level, hey, I can just double down on this one channel. I think you definitely have room in a holistic kind of strategy to bring channel expertise in, but you have to guide them with the right guardrails to ensure that the narrative is exactly right. I think one of the fundamental challenges today is that you can create virality across social channels by doing very specific things, but at the end of the day, that virality may not align with the brand that you're actually building or what you want users to do. So you kind of have to find this balance between ultimate virality and more aligned marketing campaigns that actually deliver revenue.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly put. So I know we'll run out of time very quickly. Let me ask maybe one question, and we'll go into maybe some rapid fire. Sometimes it gets a lot more fun if we do rapid fire there as well. So let me start off with a simple question. You mentioned that your earlier metric was we ranked number one, and you mentioned that that doesn't make sense anymore. So what replaces it?
Right now, I'm fundamentally focused on comparing SEO cost of user acquisition against other channel cost of user acquisition, for example. So that becomes a critical path for me. Return on ad spend variations on SEO become critical for me when I'm looking at incrementality as a function of growth. That is a more interesting metric for me nowadays than, impressions or clicks. So as you can see, every one of these is getting closer and closer I can get to ROI and revenue. If I could get it to ROI and be confident that these numbers are really what SEO ROI looks like, that's what I would be pushing. But I think where we are still is directionality. And directionality means probably one or two layers lower than specific ROI.
Okay, I think that's great. So you mentioned about what can probably replace it. Let me ask a slightly different one. What should they stop doing? What have you seen out there that they are either doing it wrong or they should not be doing it at all?
I think one of the areas that I'm really interested in GP right now is this comparative best of lists.
Mm-hmm.
I think I showed you kind of what I built on my site, which is I'm taking all the sites that are in the AI visibility space and looking at these comparative roundups where everyone compares each other against each other. And then assessing what the actual rank is amongst the peers and what
Mm.
they claim on their site. So if you on your site, you
That'll be
claim
fun.
you're the top, but when I look at, the 30 peers that also have covered your product and they rank you as number 5 as a mean average, let's say, then I discount you and I add a penalty to your overall ranking score based on that difference. So something like that is kind of what I'm doing, you know, somewhat lightheartedly as I'm reviewing this product. But that's one area that I'm concerned with. Like everybody's creating these comparative models and you use Profound does this quite a bit themselves. And maybe when you're the top in your industry, you can do this and distribute that authority to your competitors. But if you're not Profound, you'd say you're somebody that is new into this space, if you continually create comparative documents and you are putting everybody else in it, you're essentially validating what everyone else is telling. So that's kind of one of these pieces that I'm very fascinated with. And the same thing happens with content. If you're creating content and all you're saying in your content is what everybody else is saying, essentially what the consensus
Yeah.
information is, all you're doing at this point is validating what the consensus is showing. So if you're just saying exactly what ChatGPT is saying out there, then all you're doing to ChatGPT when they read it is saying, oh yeah, well, why should I need to add this? This is
Yeah.
exactly what these other 3 sites said. So how do you create separation between what you claim and what's already existing out there? And how do you position that through the prism of your brand identity and your specific IP and knowledge sphere that you're bringing into the table?
Yeah, I think that's perfectly put, and I think that probably even marks the closure of this. I mean, you nicely put it around that revenue is a primary metric that now CMOs need to drive, and most CMOs that I have partnered with, or have recruited previously in my own startups, for them revenue is not their job. Leads were used to be their jobs. The CROs, the chief revenue officers or the sales teams, they would have the quota on the revenue. So now what you're saying is it's now become a lot more important that the revenue goes on top of CMO's head as well. So it's going to be interesting. And Hank, it was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much. And we'll close on on this particular episode. I will touch upon maybe the other tactical aspects on the things that you and I we started talking, little recently about how to make it indexable. And you had a demo, and we will maybe use some of the time to actually go through the demo on that particular part. But again, thank you so much, and it was a pleasure to host you on this call.
Thank you, GP, and thanks to everyone for listening in. I really appreciate it, and I had a great time and look forward to being back.